And today, this is my talk. It's called Reigns, 1,000 Years of Deterministic Babble. And this talk is it's about a voiceover system that we created. And I'm going to talk about what worked, what didn't work, and some of the things that I might have done differently. So what is Reigns exactly? Reigns is a game where you rule a kingdom, and people come to you, your advisors, people within your principality come to you, making suggestions and things, and you sort of have this interface that's kind of like almost like a dating game, like Tinder, where you swipe left or right to make a choice, and all of your choices affect the state of things. And that's generally how it works. There's lots of different characters, different personalities. Yeah. So this was my first opportunity to experiment with spoken dialogue in a game, I would say. I was the audio director on this project, which is, in the past I've worked on games where I've done all of the content creation, but this was the first time where I sort of wanted to take a back step as far as content creation and focus more on the overall vision for the game, for the game's audio. And given that, I knew that I wanted to have the characters speak in an unfamiliar language, something that would add some character to the experience. And I was definitely thinking about games like Animal Crossing and The Sims. And I wanted to come up with a unique and systemic approach. So I wanted to try to do something a little bit different and see if we could give it a little bit of a sense of intelligence or immersion. And in thinking about this and how to maybe push it a little bit further, my mind naturally went towards popular examples of created languages, especially from television and movies and literature. So I thought about, Klingon from Star Trek, or Elvish from Lord of the Rings, or Dothraki from Game of Thrones. And these types of examples are called conlangs for constructed language. And these languages are fully functional and quite impressive. But that seemed like overkill for a fun and light game on a short timeline, a game that was developed in under a year. And building a conlang is hard work, and I'm not exactly a linguist, so I wanted to do something a little bit more streamlined. Like making a bunch of random sounds with your mouth. I mean, that's pretty easy, right? And that seemed like a good place to start. Of course, if you have something that has absolutely no structure at all, it's just noise. And so we tried to come up with some ways to remedy that.
Wasti, Regans,
Mariandi, Yandimar.
Babble, Zaukoki.
So yeah, I think it works pretty well. I mean, I would say that this sort of gibberish, it lacks the depth that you would get from a conlang, but it still manages to personify the game and the characters. And what we really tried to set out to do is take something that's kind of chaotic, where we're putting in all these different inputs, and find a way to have some sort of constructed chaos, controlled chaos. Sorry, something that has a little bit of structure to it to just make it work a little bit better. So on our project, we had a 3-person audio team, which was great. I was the audio director, and we had a sound designer and a composer, and we all worked together in developing this system. I sort of led the charge, but we all pitched in as far as recording voices and things like that. So let's talk a little bit about the recording process and our approach for how we structured the voiceover. So we designed about 20 unique voices for the game, and the voice actors were ourselves and some of our friends, and it was fun, and it was really inspiring how quickly the voices would come together. And we sort of settled on this approach, this novel approach. We would start with a seed phrase, something like this one, "Money banana stand." And we'd ask the voice actor to riff on this phrase and to embody a persona of one of the characters in the game. So in this case, we linked this phrase with this character, the jester. And we'd ask them to sort of riff in a stream of consciousness way, keeping in mind sort of the sounds associated with this phrase.
Money banana stundikipo stan banan anana akad oni imono. Oni imono knan banana snibita anigini and anagati stand babani. Mana hani onemo funo bonono ain. Bonono monoi. Bonono yini banana stindakada. Stand mo funo shimabota banana tipipo.
So yeah, it was really fun to do this. And also, having a seed phrase like this, I found that it made the performances more focused, more intentional. They all sort of operated as one unit, almost sounding like a language of sorts. Here's another example: quantization prerogative. Don't ask me what that means. I have no idea. That's just a phrase that we came up with. As a seed phrase for this character, he's sort of a nefarious, he's sort of a magician in the dark arts.
Quantatio tiza prerogative, agative concreto, prerogabidite pacizzatia, quantization prerogativia, antizati prerogative, evita catar correp. Repenoit tatsitiket tientaqua, kendon twanti cantua, quade de cotuet puevoa quative.
So that one's actually me. The other one was the composer. And so we would take these performances, the ones that we liked, and we'd chop them up into sets of anywhere from 30 to 90 assets in some cases. And we would delete the fragments that stood out in a bad way or were redundant. Sometimes you'd have repeats of certain things, and the assets themselves were usually 1 or 2 syllables, sometimes 3 or 4. And actually, we found that having a blend of those really is what helped the system to work as well as it does. Not when it's all single syllable sounds, connecting them together becomes a lot more difficult, in the sense that you just lose some of the human element and it starts to sound a little bit more robotic. It starts to sound a little bit more like Animal Crossing, which is not bad. It's really cool. It's just it's a different sort of style. And when you have multiple, when you have multisyllabic phrases, you get a little bit more of that human element in the way that the human voice connects sounds together, you get a little bit more emotion. And so that was something we kept in mind. Also, cutting at hard syllables seemed to work really well. So something like brero or di, like having those hard transients really helped with connecting different fragments that may have been pulled from different sections of a recording. And even like vowels could be used as hard syllables in some cases, depending on the performance. So now here's what those sound like chopped up.
Quantatio tizza diza prerogative agative ocrereto prerogabilite pacetzatia quanti.
Okay, so let's talk about the implementation process now, because we have these recordings of different voices and we've chopped them up into these little fragments. And now we have to figure out how to actually put them together in a way that sounds reasonable. So let's take this character as an example, Lady Grey. Here's a card with some text from the game. And so, thinking about how to implement this, you started thinking about, okay, how are we going to differentiate the characters? What can we do? And, what will some of the parameters be that will help us to do that? And so this is what we came up with. It's a short list of parameters, but they all give us a certain amount of variability and control. So it's simple, but enough levers that to separate the characters from each other. So we have voice type, which is just which set of recorded fragments are we going to use for this character. Pitch, whether we want to make this character's voice a little slower and deeper, or maybe we want to make it a little higher and thinner. This was just a nice element to have. After recording the voices, maybe sometimes we wanted to tweak them a little bit. There are also more. We had about 20 voice sets that we created, but there were more characters than that, and so we did end up doing double usage in some cases, and so this was a nice way to differentiate with that. Resonant frequency is sort of like, it's just a parametric EQ essentially, picking a frequency to boost, just to give to have another lever for kind of adjusting the timbre of a voice. And then fragment overlap size, which is basically taking the fragments that we've generated and figuring out how much distance to put between them, or maybe negative distance to get them closer together. And then as far as a global parameter goes, we had to figure out, okay, how long do we want these performances to be? So we had to come up with a text-to-speech ratio for duration, based on how much text there is, how much speech should there be, and how long should it be. And this is really important because, it was important to maintain a certain flow for the gameplay. People could be swiping through cards relatively quickly, and so we didn't want the audio experience to be getting cut off constantly by the user's just natural flow. So, the speech should never get too long. It should never be more than a couple of seconds. But if this text is short, then the speech should be shorter to reflect that. So the question was, how long should this performance be? And what's going to feel natural? And the answer was pretty obvious. It's n over 55. Okay, maybe this isn't that obvious. But this is what worked. And what we're talking about here is length in time of the speech. So length equals n over 55. So, what's n? N is the character count. So it's the number of characters in this card. And 55, what is 55? It's nothing. It's an arbitrary number, and trial and error is what yielded this formula, where length equals character count divided by 55. And so for this example, n, the character count is 87. There's 87 characters in this the text of this card, and this formula works out to about 1.58 seconds. And given the card text limit, the duration will never get too long. So this works out well. So now that we have that, the way that the system works is we take the card text and we use it as a seed. And so what that means is we take that text and we use it as a way to deterministically generate random values, and then we use those random values to select which voice fragments to play. And we'll do this as many times as it takes to reach the desired speech length, which in this case was 1.58 seconds. So, in this example, we have 3 fragments: anats, bananda, and usta. This is just a made-up example. But between those and then the fragment overlap for this character, which is a negative overlap, which brings them closer together, that all together, it puts us past the desired length. And this boundary that we're using is actually it's a soft boundary. So, going over a bit on time is okay, because it's just getting in the ballpark is what we want, and also it'll always play at least one fragment, which is important, because you don't want it, if it's a really short piece of text, you don't want it to play nothing. That wouldn't work. So yeah, and because it's seeded by the text, the cards always trigger the same speech fragments every time, which is neat. It makes playback reproducible. It makes it easier to test. And one of the hypotheses was maybe this feels a little less random. It's hard to say for sure, but that was the intent. And then as far as making the performances feel more natural, having the overlapping fragments, it really allowed us to dial in speaking styles. Maybe for certain sets of voice sets, the speech is slower, and so we want to adjust the overlap accordingly to match the personality of the character we're trying to show. And the last thing that we did is the longest fragment that we chose, we always put it at the end, and we found that this just sounded better. It sounded a little bit more natural, and I think a lot of that has to do with the way that we chopped up these performances. A single syllable that gets chopped up tends to be at the beginning of a phrase or in the middle of a recorded phrase. If it's multiple syllables and therefore a longer length, those tend to be at the end of a phrase. And so those just naturally seem to sound better at the end of these stitched together performances. So that's basically how the system works. Just a quick kind of run through. And I want to talk a little bit about, what went right and what went wrong with this system, and some future ideas about how to improve on it. So I think overall, we all felt pretty good about it. Felt like stitching fragments together works well. As far as some categories that we can talk about language. I think we could have done a bit more to tie the gibberish together. What if everyone spoke the same strain of gibberish? That might have felt more intelligent as opposed to having all these different strains. Although, that does differentiate the characters a bit. So it's sort of that might have been sort of a trade-off there. But definitely something that I think is worth thinking about. And then there's performance. So I think we could have hired more actors. We could have recorded more voices, of course. Maybe taken it a bit more seriously. I mean, we were having a lot of fun with it, but I think if we had honed in a little bit on the direction, we might have, we might have been able to improve the results somewhat. We sort of went about it. We just went about it in a loose way. Like, I would record a couple of voices. The sound designer would record a couple of voices on his end. Like, there wasn't a super unified kind of approach. It was more loose and broad. And so sort of the thing that really drove the system, the deterministic method that we came up with, I think we felt like it was interesting. It's good for testing because it's reproducible. But honestly, it's not that noticeable for people, and I think because of that, it kind of undercuts the design, because the intention was for it to really lend this sense of embodiment and intelligence to the speech, and because it's it's still just kind of, it doesn't quite hit that mark. I don't think. But overall, I would say, it's as successful as a proof of concept, and between all three categories. But between all three categories, I think we could have just did more to create a sense of immersion and a sense of intelligence with the system. I think if I could do it again, I would try to find a more effective deterministic method. Something that would add another layer as far as differentiating the characters, making it feel more like some kind of culture, a shared culture between the characters, since they're all living in and around your kingdom. These are some of the things that I would have tried to do if I had the chance to do it again. Perhaps a system, that seeds based on syllables instead of paragraph length would have given us a better way to do these sorts of things. And I actually built such a system that went unused for another project, but it worked really well. And the idea was that you would map syllables of the text directly to the syllable recordings, and using a similar deterministic method. And what that would do is it would give the invented language a much more coherent sound, and your experience of it would be, it would feel more intelligent. If you had a repeated segment of speech like ho ho or no no no, the system would reflect that, and that made it feel even more like a real language. Or you might pick up on themes of conversation if multiple characters are talking about some particular thing and they keep using certain words. You might actually be able to pick up on those things, and over time you might, through sort of a subtle method, start to internalize a sense of this language, even though it's completely fabricated and doesn't really have any function. And the other thing is machine learning. I mean, there's been amazing advances in speech synthesis. Just recently there was a paper where now your voice can be almost completely replicated with only 5 seconds of your recorded speech, which is scary and amazing. I think something along these lines could lend itself to a really interesting game implementation for procedurally generating speech, and I'm really excited to see something like that happen in the future. I think there's a lot of, I think we've barely touched the surface of what's possible for invented language in games, and I think it's a really interesting space. Most of the stuff that I've seen to this point has been, mostly based on aesthetic, and I think it would be interesting to see more investigation into ways of making these invented languages have a sense of function, even if they don't really have any function at all. So I'm excited to see what we come up with. I think so. I think the fun is what really drove the process. It was the idea of doing something new personally for myself, is something I'd never done before, but also seeing like how we can take some of the touchstones for this kind of thing, like The Sims and Animal Crossing, and do something a little bit different. Certainly, it can be a technical rabbit hole. Like you can get really deep with it, and in some of my other experimentations with this kind of thing, it can be really challenging to get good results. Like I was talking about having systems that are based on single syllables. That is a really hard thing to do, to concatenate, like combine single syllable sounds into speech that sounds pleasing and doesn't just sound like a robot. It's really hard. It's a really hard problem. So yeah, I mean, I think ultimately it was more of an artful process than maybe like an intellectual one. And in that manner, at times it was about picking the path of least resistance, picking the thing that was going to give us the most bang for our buck, and not get us stuck in some sort of technological trap. No, we didn't think about that. I think that would have. I mean, I'm sure it could have worked, but there was something nice about just having those, and also it was really challenging, I think, from a design perspective. But there's something really interesting about having those glyphs, essentially, and occasionally you'd have these like storyboards that were meant to convey information. That to me felt like a different thing. I mean, it's possible that we could have done something with sound, but I think it kind of accomplished what it was trying to do without it. Well, I was sort of the first person brought onto this project, and so in that way, in some ways it kind of fell upon me to make some suggestions about how to move forward. I think originally the expectation and the intention was that I would do the music, but as I got into it, I realized that I was a little bit more interested in the systems, as opposed to actually creating the content, and that I would open it up to some other people to get involved, and I would just focus on supporting them and focusing on the systems. And so that's really where I started, and that was kind of what I was most interested in. I was interested in this voiceover system, building that, and I was also interested in this music system that we built for this game, which was sort of also a phrase-based system that used it was a 4-part voice leading, soprano, alto, tenor, bass, and those 4 parts were mapped to the four categories that you're trying to manage in the game. I think they're like religion, the military, the people, and maybe the treasury or something like that. So each one of those voices is sort of mapped to those in some fairly straightforward senses, like driving audio, but also that had other challenges as far as figuring out how to build out a music system that would transition through the many different sort of story phases in the game. Yeah, that's a good question. I'm pretty sure that the I'm pretty sure that that the text is always English that it uses to seed, but actually now that I think about it, I'm actually not sure. That's actually something that we should look into. It'd be interesting to see if it's different. That would be appropriate, I think. Yeah, it was a really good experience for me to be in that role, because it helped me to learn that I really don't like managing people at all. But I also learned that I really like getting involved with systems and building systems. I find it really interesting, and I've already done a lot of systems work since then. I've been working with Dino Polo Club out of New Zealand for the last six odd years, working on Mini Metro, Mini Motorways, and I've done lots of systems work for those games. And then on Solar Ash, I've been doing a lot of systems work as well. So there's definitely, I've always had a bit of an itch for that, for the technical problem solving and coming up with novel approaches to things. And so between that and learning that I don't really want to be an audio director. And actually for Heart Machine, we actually, that was a role that was, that was mine in theory if I wanted it, and we ended up bringing in somebody else to take on that role because I didn't want to do it. It's hard to say. It's a totally different form factor, especially a radio program. When you don't have the context that you get from visuals, then you're really asking a lot from gibberish, I think. I think as a result of that, the gibberish would be more effective if the context was really dialed in on the audio side. And for that, I think about the Sims, because the way that they use Simlish, they tend to really dress it up in the context of what it's trying to do. So you're doing a radio show, you have all the bells and whistles that go along with that, the tone of the voices, the rhythm of the performances, maybe there's music and little sound effects and things that all kind of contribute to that. It also depends on what your goals are with the gibberish. Like, are you trying to build a sense of like people actually understanding the content, or is it more just about an impression and creating a feeling? And all of those things really matter as far as how you would go about something. So I would keep those in mind. It's hard to give specific suggestions without knowing what the ultimate goals were, but that's what I would say.